This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. One of the last items to go on temporary display at Hampton Court Palace all the way back before lockdown started in 2020 was a T-shaped cloth of silver, covered in beautifully detailed embroidery that incorporated gold and silver thread. It is known as the Bacton altarcloth, and it may once have been part of one of the fabulous gowns worn by Queen Elizabeth I. Today, we're going to take a look at this cloth and its potential history. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring another video on this channel. When it comes to building, updating and managing my website, Squarespace really has made all the difference. Squarespace's Blueprint website design tool offers me a massive variety of website templates, all of which are super easy to customize in every way. This is due to their Fluid Engine website design system. With this, it's simply a case of dragging and dropping. For even more convenience, you can edit your website not only on your desktop, but also on your phone. I can keep track of my website traffic through a whole bunch of useful analytics tools. Above all, this has been really helpful to keep an eye on my mailing list emails, to make sure they have all reached their intended destination, but also to see if, or indeed when, they have been opened, and what links are being clicked in them. If you have signed up to receive emails from me but you haven't seen them yet, please have a little check to make sure they've not been caught up in your spam filter. To build, launch and manage your own website, go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/readingthepast to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. But now it's time for us to take a look at what may be Elizabeth I's lost gown. Parts of the building of St Faith's Church in Bacton, Herefordshire date back to the early 13th century, but it also shows significant phases of construction and indeed reconstruction in both the 15th and 16th centuries. Arguably, one of the most notable things about this church is that it once housed the Bacton altarcloth, hence the name that item is now known by. Today, a copy of the original cloth hangs framed on the wall, just as the original had done for more than a century previously. This church is also the burial place for much of the Parry family. I say much of because arguably the best known member of this family is not buried at Bacton, but rather at Westminster, which in itself is evidence of her prominence. Nevertheless, this figure is memorialised at Bacton too. The National Churches Trust explains that, quote, "The Blanche Parry monument, commissioned for herself by Blanch, the confidant of Queen Elizabeth I, is dated to before 1578, and so is the earliest known representation of the Queen as an icon, as Gloriana. It preserves the process of change, an unique process not often seen, from the historical portrayal of the Queen to the iconographical." This monument also features a 28-line inscription that might have been composed by Blanche herself. From it we learn that she, quote, "trained was in princes' courts, that she served Elizabeth from the time that she rocked her in her cradle through the time, quote, when she her crown achieved, so that I my time did pass away, a maid in court and never no man's wife, sworn of the Queen Elizabeth's bedchamber always. With maiden queen, a maid did end my life." Blanche's biographer, Peter R. Roberts, explains that Blanche, quote, "was probably introduced to the court by her maternal aunt and namesake, Blanche Herbert, Lady Herbert of Troy, who became principal lady of Elizabeth's household in 1536. A letter from Sir Robert Tewett to the 1st Duke of Somerset, dated to the 31st of January 1549, indicates that Blanche Herbert had intended Parry to be her successor, but that this position was taken instead by Kate Astley. On Elizabeth's accession, Blanche Parry was made a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber, with a salary of £33 6 shillings and 8pence, and in 1565 she succeeded Astley as Chief Gentlewoman. One of the many side effects of having Elizabeth as a female regnant queen who never married was that there was no private household space in which the men of her court could obtain a place and hold prominence. Now, Elizabeth's Privy Council was certainly an all-male group of advisers, but she could choose to avoid them completely by staying in her private apartments if she so wished, and she could do so for quite some time. This was her Privy Chamber, and her Privy Chamber was staffed by her ladies. These rooms were a space that no man could enter without express permission, and so, with no husband, there was not even a man who could press a claim to marital duty so he could access the Queen if, or rather when, she chose to shut herself away. For men who sought influence and power, the smart choice was then to befriend one or more of Elizabeth's ladies, and to do, on occasion, as they were bid by them. These ladies could call in favours, and they could advise and influence these men as they wished, and so these women enjoyed a kind of influence and prestige that was unmatched by those that came before, and, for around a century, those that followed them. Blanche Parry ensured that the benefit of her influence would be directed to the places and people of her choosing. In one case, those benefits are still being literally paid forward today. Blanche came from New Court, Bacton originally, and this was a fact that she seemingly never forgot, because in addition to that memorial she commissioned for herself in the Bacton church, she also left a financial bequest that endures through to the present. Roberts describes how, quote, an annual bequest of £28 continues to be paid to the parishioners of Bacton and Newton in the early 21st century. However, it is possible that this was not all that was bequeathed to her parish, either by Blanche or in her name. And so we come to the first extant reference to the Bacton altar cloth, and in a moment we will look at the first extant reference connecting Blanche to the Bacton altar cloth. First up, Hilary Lynn references an item in the Bacton Parish magazine from September 1910, which details how, quote, from 1879, an annual ecclesiastical and educational art exhibition was established to accompany the peripatetic church congress. It appears that the altar cloth was often removed from Bacton and displayed at these exhibitions, an indication perhaps of how exceptionally fine that altar cloth was. Then a, quote, piece of embroidery from the parish of Bacton is described in the minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries in London on the 18th of June 1885. These minutes explain that one of the fellows of this society, George Lambert, said that it was, quote, an altar cloth worked by Blanche Parry. The description of the shape of this item as found in the minutes is, I think, recognisable as being the Bacton altar cloth, as is the fact that we are informed that the embroidery's, quote, design is in no way of a religious character. Birds, beasts and creeping things, boats with their occupants, flowers, leaves and fruits constitute a decoration which has at one time been very beautiful, though it has suffered much from rough usage. Then, in 1918, Lionel Cust wrote about the Bacton altar cloth in an article for the Burlington magazine. The title of this piece is Queen Elizabeth's Kirtle. In the concluding paragraphs of his article, Cust asserts that, quote, this piece of embroidery is clearly a strip from a skirt or kirtle. He then proceeds to connect it to Queen Elizabeth I when he explains that the, quote, combination of flowers and animals, like those found on the Bacton altar cloth, is especially remarkable in the great portrait of Queen Elizabeth at Hardwicke Hall, and it is quite reasonable to suggest that the embroidery given by Mistress Parry to Bacton Church is a piece of an actual kirtle worn by Queen Elizabeth, though it can hardly be as early in date even as the Hardwicke portrait. Local tradition attributes the embroidery to Mistress Parry herself, but although she must, like all other ladies, have been expert with her needle, it is quite likely that she obtained it as a perquisite due to Her Majesty's principal gentlewoman. Previously in this article, Cust referenced other embroidered dresses that appear in portraits of Elizabeth, like the Rainbow Portrait, and the Wanstead or Walbeck portrait that, like the Hardwick Hall portrait, depict a similar fabric to that which we see in the Bacton example. We know that Elizabeth I had an enormous number of garments. According to an inventory that was made at the end of her life, this amounted to some 1,900 items. But she almost certainly will have owned more than this throughout her life, though, because the gifting of second-hand garments by those higher up the social order to those lower down than them was a frequent occurrence. When clothes or fabrics came from a royal, they were usually incredibly valuable to the person who received them. The materials used alone made them costly, and thus they were things that could be exchanged for large sums of money if the need ever arose. Additionally, though, the very provenance of an item like this was evidence of valuable royal favour, even of royal patronage, and so it therefore confers social capital upon the recipient, a capital that would likely be useful in their interactions with their wider community, because a person who has earned the trust and favour of the monarch should also be a person who has the trust and favour of those around them. Due to her well-established and long-lasting closeness and trust with the Queen, I think it's very likely that Blanche would have been gifted items by Elizabeth. Indeed, I think it's almost impossible that she wouldn't have been. Now, whether or not the Bacton altarcloth is one of these items remains up for debate, as does the suggestion that Blanche was involved in creating this piece of fabric. After all, Lionel Cust finishes his article by pointing out that Blanche may not have been able to produce this quality of embroidery, as, quote, she was moreover quite blind at the time of her death. In any circumstances, this embroidery remains as a precious relic of the great reign of Elizabeth. If we wish to gain a better insight into the Bacton altarcloth and its true origins, we can turn to the writings of Hilary Lynn. Her work on this item began in 2015, and through it she sought to outline, quote, the cloth's background, provenance, materials and technique, and to compare it to extant objects in order to, quote, build the case that this rare and important embroidered cloth can be associated directly with Elizabeth I herself. Analysis of the cloth has shown that a primary or first stage of embroidery occurred in a professional workshop, using a large frame, with subsequent or secondary work occurring in a smaller frame, likely in a domestic setting. We are told, quote, it is made of finely ribbed white silk, with a secondary weft of silver metal strip thread, known as silver chamlet in the 16th century. Botanical and flower motifs are embroidered in evenly positioned rows in polychrome silk and gold metal thread. These motifs represent a first stage of embroidery, and are probably a very rare surviving example of professional workmanship. A secondary stage of embroidery appears around the larger flower motifs, executed in a cruder but not unskilled hand. This secondary stage features small creatures, figures and insects. I have made videos on the symbolism found in the portraits of Elizabeth I that I will be leaving linked, but if this fabric was once worn by her, perhaps as a petticoat, it would fit with the general pattern of her royal identity shaping. It also indicates that the garments we see depicted in the portraits of her may well have existed physically as well as allegorically. To dress Elizabeth in a skirt or a full gown made out of fabric like this, covered in blossoming flowers, in thriving plants, connects her to the idea of fertility. Although she may have chosen to be England's Virgin Queen, nevertheless, we are being told, she remains a fertile ruler of a thriving nation. The individual flowers each have their own significance, which would have been particularly legible to the Queen's contemporaries. As Lynn explains, quote, the white lily stood for purity, rosemary for remembrance, pansies for thought, and of course, the Tudor rose represented the personal badge of the Tudor house and of the Queen herself. While these were exactly the kinds of flowers that Elizabeth would like to dress herself in, as part of her own royal self-fashioning, it is also possible that one of her courtiers might have commissioned a gown of this kind so that they could show their loyalty to the Queen. They may have spent considerable sums to adorn themselves in floral motifs to please the Queen by showing her how they viewed her. And the same may also be true and be the reason behind the addition of those beasts of the land, sea and air that we see. On the one hand, this may be an assertion of devotion to all of God's divine creation, but equally it might also be a claim or an indication of Elizabeth's skill and control in husbandry. She is therefore doing as God instructed. She is governing them all appropriately and with skill, just as she is governing her land and her subjects as England's regnant queen. In her article, Hilary Lynn highlights similarities when the Bacton cloth is compared with various embroidery samples in the Victorian Albert Museum collection, with engravings found in books, and with fabric motifs as shown in portraiture. In doing this, she is able to point out a potential date range of around 1600 and almost certainly after 1590 for this fabric to have been created. She points out that this corresponds with records of Elizabeth's great wardrobe because, as she explains, quote, "The combination of floral embroidery upon silver shamlet only occurs post 1590. As Blanche Parry died in 1590, this does arguably somewhat scupper the assertion that she would have been given an item of clothing by Elizabeth after the Queen had finished wearing it, that she then could later bequeath to the church at Bacton. The dating also makes it unlikely that Blanche was involved in embroidering the Bacton altar cloth, as has also been suggested. Nevertheless, the extraordinary quality of this piece of cloth, the materials that went into its creation, and the skill and scale of the embroidery make it almost impossible that it wasn't owned by someone of great prominence at the royal court. In Elizabeth's later years, she certainly wore finely ornamented gowns of white silk. And so perhaps then, as Lynn suggests, it was Elizabeth who donated this incredibly fine and expensive fabric to the church at Bacton, with the intention that they would use it in memory of Blanche. After all, Blanche was a woman who had served Elizabeth faithfully from this Queen's infancy, who evidently continued to inspire her monarch's trust and affection as time went on. Lynn writes that, quote, "The cloth's use as an altar or communion textile is compelling. Its use as a sacred item means that it was especially revered, and, with other evidence, supports its royal origins. Blanche's memorial within the church at Bacton shows her kneeling in devotion with, or perhaps to, Elizabeth." However, Lynn also adds, quote, "There is no documentary evidence or definitive link to prove that this was one of Elizabeth's own garments, or that it belonged to Blanche. However, the very strong inference to be drawn is that this late 16th century elite, professionally embroidered court gown entered the small church of Bacton by gift of the Queen in memory of Blanche Parry for use as a ceremonial textile. It is a rare example of royal Tudor dress that has survived, anonymously, for centuries." So what do you think of the Bacton altar cloth? Of its potential origins? Do you think that it was once part of a garment worn by Queen Elizabeth I? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, which will get this video shared out more, which should help us to grow our community. There's only one way to go, and that's something dressy or frocky. So hop into the emoji section and see what you can find that relates to this. A lady in a dress by itself. I look forward to seeing what you pick. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? If you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me about this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel if you think you are subscribed. Have a check now, just to make sure you have not been mysteriously unsubscribed against your will while you are there. checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear. And that way YouTube claim they will tell you when I'm next uploaded, but also when I'm next going live, which I do to talk about the history news. It's happening once a month at the moment. I get lots of articles sent to me and we go through them together. We have, of course, got our failsafe. Head to my website. I will link it. It is www.katrinamarchant.com. If you head to the contact page of my website, you'll see this box. Put your email address in the box, hit sign up. That will add you to my list and let me send you an email once a week so I can tell you what I've been up to, but also so I can share with you the useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're all going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.